Hello, welcome everyone to tonight's presentation with Dr. Rob Cuthrell. My name is Marisa Gomez and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. We are honored to bring you this program in partnership with Amah Mutsun Land Trust as part of a series of events from the museum this month celebrating Indigenous culture in honor of Native American Heritage Month. And tonight's program is also delving into the world of seeds, and the museum also has a special exhibit up through the end of this month, all about seeds. I'm going to share my screen once more because I want to start out the evening by acknowledging that the land on which the museum resides is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. Today, these lands are stewarded by the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, who are working hard to fulfill their obligation to Creator, to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts in the Amah Mutsun Land Trust. I also want to share that we'll be communicating with you tonight via the chat, and we'd love it if you could send your messages to everyone. So maybe take a moment to change that setting now and let us know where you're streaming in from, maybe using the chat. And at this point, I am going to be welcoming in tonight's presenter. We're excited to have with us tonight Dr. Rob Cuthrell, who is a researcher in archaeology and historical ecology, who has studied relationships between Indigenous people in landscapes west of the Santa Cruz Mountains for over a decade. Currently, Rob works as a consultant for Amah Mutsun Land Trust, managing a native plant propagation and restoration project on Año Nuevo Point. And I first encountered Rob on a visit to the Cuthrell Valley Cultural Preserve near Año Nuevo Point, and the stories and insights that I learned from him there have been very formative for me, and I'm looking forward to digging deeper tonight, so to speak. And we at the museum are so grateful that he is lending us his time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Rob, but actually first thing, I'm just going to remind you that we're going to be using the chat to communicate. So throughout the presentation, type in your questions or your thoughts there. And then at the end, I will help relay those to Rob. So here we go, Rob.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Marissa, for that excellent introduction. And thanks to the Museum of Natural History for inviting Amah Mutsun Land Trust to talk to everybody tonight about the research that we've been doing and the work that the tribe and the Land Trust are doing to restore native landscapes and Indigenous stewardship. So let me switch my screen over to the presentation and we'll get started. All right. And Marissa, is that showing up for us okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Great, thank you. All right, so we'll start off tonight just by saying that, you know, Indigenous people of California, often when we hear about the foods that they ate, especially the plant foods, people will tend to focus on nuts and especially acorns. And it's kind of a stereotype that, you know, native Californian people subsisted primarily on acorns, but actually they used a really wide variety of plant foods, including a lot of plant foods that came from prairies and, you know, shrublands and wetlands and lots of different vegetation types. And today we'll be talking about specifically the coastal prairie foods that people were eating and the research that we've been doing to understand how they were tending coastal prairies and harvesting those resources. So I wanted to start off just by showing this photo of Nate Vasquez, one of the tribe members and a former native steward of the Amah Mutsun Land Trust. This was from more than 5 years ago now when we were doing a practice demonstration of making pinole, which is the traditional way of preparing grasses and other seed foods to make things like porridges or granola type bars and things like that. And here's Nathan blowing the chaff out of a basket full of California bromegrass seeds after lightly grinding them off. And then down here on the lower right are examples of archaeological bromegrass seeds, which we had recovered from a site that was not very far away from the area where we were doing this pinole demonstration. In association with the seeds exhibit, I've included plenty of seed pictures in the presentation tonight, which I'm really happy to be able to do. I spent many years of my life in graduate school staring through a microscope at seeds, and I rarely get to really focus on the seeds and show them to people. So I'm really excited to be able to do that tonight. So in the past, especially throughout most of the 20th century, whenever academics were talking about Native people in California, they would often just call them hunter-gatherers, which evokes an image of people kind of wandering the landscape and harvesting whatever they happen to come across. But that's not how Native Californian peoples interacted with their landscape at all. And the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band considers that label to be offensive because they consider themselves to be land stewards and land managers. And over the past few decades, researchers have begun to acknowledge this as well and go back and, looking at ethnographic studies and oral histories and working together with contemporary tribes. Researchers have really come to understand that Native people in California were land stewards who took care of and enhanced the productivity of natural resources in their traditional territories. There have been a few books about this published in the last couple of decades. One of them, Forgotten Fires, was based on research that was done as early as the 1950s, but it didn't get published until the early 2000s. And then these two other books here, Tending the Wild and California Indians and Their Environment, I'd really recommend those to anybody who'd like to learn more about this subject of how Native people tend plants and tend landscapes. And one of the things that we've learned from this research and from working with Native people and learning from them is that the use of fire as a tool for managing vegetation and landscapes was extremely important throughout the state. It was the most powerful tool that Native people had for managing their landscapes. And both of these, all of these books focus on fire and the effects of fire for maintaining prairie landscapes and rangelands and enhancing landscape diversity and productivity. So starting all the way back in 2007, when I was just beginning my graduate school work, I met a tribe member named Chuck Striplin, who was getting his PhD in environmental science at Berkeley. And we began working together to put together an integrative historical ecological study of Native people and their relationships with their environments and the natural resources that they used in the area west of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we got a lot of excellent guidance on that project by some of the folks who came to lead it, Professor Kent Lightfoot at UC Berkeley, and Mark Hilkema of the Santa Cruz District of State Parks. And this was a collaborative research project, meaning that not only were we collaborating between different universities and agencies, but the tribe, Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, was a partner in the project as well. And so when it came to guiding how the research was done, it was really important to get the approval and the support of the tribal leadership, and especially Chairman Valentin Lopez. So these are from some of our meetings over the years about our research project. So our purpose with this project was to bring as many different academic disciplines together as we could, as well as things like tribal oral history and narratives, and ethnographic studies and reports and histories to understand, in this area west of the Santa Cruz Mountains, how far back does this cultural burning, this prescribed burning go, and what were its effects on the landscape over the long term? When we look back, not just at the time of Spanish colonization, but in the centuries prior to that, do we see a landscape that was transformed by indigenous stewardship, or do we see a landscape that looked similar to how we think it would have looked if there was no prescribed burning? So that's kind of our main research question. We came to focus our research on this place, Coroste Valley Cultural Preserve, which is part of Año Nuevo State Park. This is a place that was designated as a cultural preserve in 2008 because it contains a lot of cultural history for the Koroste tribe. It contains a large number of archaeological sites. We also think that it's the location of first contact between the Portola expedition of 1769 and the Koroste tribe. And we, based on the description that the Portola expedition made of that location, we think that this was the location of a Koroste settlement, possibly their main settlement, that was called Matene. And Matene had a large dance house or ceremonial structure that was hemispherical, and the Portola expedition members said that it was large enough to hold the entire village of 200 people in it. So this would have been a very special place on the landscape for the Koroste tribe, one of their central places. And the designation of this place as a cultural preserve acknowledged that historical significance of the Koroste presence there. And what the cultural preserve designation allows is for state parks to develop a co-management relationship with Indigenous people in the area. And in this case, particularly with the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band and Amah Mutsun Land Trust. And ever since 2008, our research and our relationships that we've been building between the tribe, the land trust, and state parks is based around returning Indigenous stewardship to this area. But first, having to understand what Indigenous stewardship would have looked like here and what Native people were doing to tend the land and what it would have looked like in the past, what types of plants would be growing there in the past. I just wanted to show everybody our reconstructed map of tribal territories. So these are tribes in the Santa Cruz Mountains, the northern Santa Cruz Mountains area. And this is a rough estimation of what the tribal territories would have been. As you can see, the Koroste tribe had a relatively large territory. We think that they would have been one of the more locally influential or powerful tribes. They were a tribe that resisted missionization by the Spanish. They stayed out of the mission system for the most part. And soon after Mission Santa Cruz was founded, they actually attacked Mission Santa Cruz along with a cohort of Native people from other tribes, burning down one of the buildings there. They provided refuge for Native people from other tribes who ran away from the mission system. But after they attacked Mission Santa Cruz, the Spanish colonial authorities became very upset about the whole situation and sent a lot of soldiers and things into the area to put pressure on Koroste people. And by the 1790s, most Koroste people, as well as most other Native people in this area, were coerced into the mission systems, where they experienced tremendous death and cultural loss over the following decades. But the Koroste tribe had access to a variety of different resources that made them less dependent on other tribes. They had a great source of Monterey chert, which is a tool stone out at the coast at Año Nuevo Point. They harvested lots of olivella shells, which they made into currency. And they had, these extensive coastal prairies west of the Santa Cruz Mountains on the marine terraces and the foothills that the Spanish describe in the earliest documents of the explorers, as well as lots of territory upland in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where they could move to in the fall to harvest acorns and other forest resources. And in the early phase of our research, from about 2007 until 2013 or 2014, it mostly focused on this place, Koroste Valley Cultural Preserve, and on one particular archaeological site in the preserve. So I'll talk a little bit about the cultural preserve and fire ecology and its history. So here's a photograph of the valley floor from several years ago. And you can see now it's a mix of different vegetation types. There's northern coastal scrub, shrubland that's covering a lot of the landscape. On the hillsides to the upper left, you can see young Douglas fir trees that have come in the past few decades. There's a riparian corridor that is sort of on the far end of this picture, where you might be able to tell the grayish looking buckeye trees that are down there in the riparian zone. And then there's some spots of coastal prairie. but not very extensive, not nearly as extensive, even as it was a few decades ago, and certainly not as extensive as it would have been several hundred years ago when Native people were managing the landscape. So for those who may not be familiar, I want to talk a little bit about fire ecology in the Santa Cruz Mountains area. So this map on the right here is showing lightning strike density in different parts of California. And you can see that most of Central California, coastal California, is this dark blue color. And that's the lowest lightning strike density, 0 to 5 lightning strikes per 100 square kilometers per year. And we think that only a small percentage of those strikes, something like 1% or so, results in a meaningful wildfire that could spread. And so what fire ecologists in the region expect is that under a natural lightning ignited fire regime, under which Native people would not have been igniting fires or using prescribed burning, that the lightning fire regime would be characterized by infrequent fire, that you might only get a fire once every 50 to 100 years or even more, depending on where on the landscape you are and what kind of fire breaks you have around you and things like that. And one thing that has become really clear to me is that coastal areas, especially low-lying coastal areas, get very few lightning strikes. So you have to sort of have special conditions come together in order to get a widespread wildfire that would burn really expansive areas, and it wouldn't happen very frequently. So under these conditions, what we expect is that most of the time, the landscape would be covered with woody vegetation types. It's only in a short period of time following a fire when you'd have the removal of that woody vegetation. It would be in the process of regenerating or resprouting. That's when you would get more extensive herbaceous vegetation, so grasslands or coastal prairies. On the other hand, we know that by the time the Spanish colonized California, indigenous people had created and maintained extensive coastal prairies throughout this part of the California coast. When the Spanish come up the coast, sometimes they describe days where the burning that Native people had done was so extensive that they had to search for a campsite in a place where there was still enough forage for their animals to feed on because all the rest of the landscape had been burned off. And they described the coastal landscapes as being dominated by these extensive grasslands. So that's what we expect under conditions of indigenous burning. We know that Native people were burning these coastal prairies probably once every 2 to 5 years or so, sometimes maybe a bit less frequently than that. But that's what it takes to keep the northern coastal shrublands held back, because our shrublands in this area are full of species that resprout vigorously once they're top killed, whether it's by fire or mowing or whatever else. So the amount of disturbance that's needed to convert shrubland into a coastal prairie is quite frequent, requires much more frequent fire than you could have under a natural lightning fire regime. And so as part of our research project, we've got these expectations about fire ecology and how it works in the area. And we wanted to test out, is that really how it works on the landscape? And Coroste Valley is a good laboratory for that, because it was used for agriculture and grazing up until the 1970s or so. And then state parks acquired the property in the early 1980s. And for about 30 years after that, it was managed as a wilderness area. And so we got to see sort of the course of vegetation succession without any type of disturbance like burning or anything else. And so what this map is showing up here at the top, we've got 2 aerial photos, one from the early 80s, one from the early 2010s, and then vegetation maps based on those photos showing how the vegetation types changed in the absence of disturbance over this 30-year period. And so the green is the coastal prairie, yellow is shrublands, red is Doug fir, and blue is the riparian corridor. And what you can see is that the amount of coastal prairie shrunk quite dramatically as especially Douglas fir expanded to take over the landscape. So the amount of coastal prairie went from being about 40% of the landscape to being less than 15% of the landscape. And what we can tell from this is that, in the absence of a disturbance factor like fire, this will continue into the future and the coastal prairies will be lost. And we don't want that to happen for many reasons. From the perspective of the tribe, the coastal prairies are very important for providing for people and animals and for insects and the ecology at large. From a conservation perspective, it's also very important for us to maintain our coastal prairies because they contain a large number of endemic species and high biodiversity. Endemic species are species that don't occur anywhere else. So, if the coastal prairies in California are lost to, succession to other vegetation types or agriculture or, other factors, these species could be impacted and lost as well. So what this shows is that our expectations about fire ecology and vegetation succession do appear to be correct. In the absence of some kind of disturbance, the landscape becomes dominated by these woody vegetation types. So starting back in 2007, the part of the project that I was most involved in was the archaeological research, and I'm going to focus on that for a bit. So our collaborative archaeological research project began in Coroste Valley, where we spent about 8 years doing research. And then we entered a second phase of the project, where we expanded out and looked at several other archaeological sites in southern San Mateo County and northern Santa Cruz County on the coast. And here's just some photographs from our fieldwork. During all of our fieldwork, we involved Amah Mutsun Tribal Band members with UC Berkeley students and volunteers and graduate students. So everybody got a chance to work together and learn about, how archaeology can be used to learn new information about how Native people were using natural resources and taking care of them in the past. Here's another shot from some of our field work. This is from a site in northern Santa Cruz County. And here's the process that we use archaeologically to recover plant remains. So if you imagine you're just out on the landscape and you're preparing some food and you drop some of it on the ground, it's going to biodegrade. So insects will eat it, or microbes will break it down, or fungi will break it down. And so in order for something to be preserved archaeologically in this region, it has to be charred. It has to be burned, which converts it from material that is biologically useful to organisms into elemental carbon, which is basically like a fragile little fossil. And those charred bits of seed and nutshell and wood, they can persist in soils for thousands of years. And then archaeologists have developed this technique called flotation to separate out the charred plant remains from other materials that you have at archaeological sites. And the way that this works is you have this flotation tank where you take a soil sample and dump it into the top and stir it around with your hands. And that releases the seeds and the wood charcoal and anything else that floats up to the top of the water, where it goes out of a spout and gets caught in some kind of mesh. And then you also recover all the materials and artifacts that sink, things like bones and pieces of stone tools and anything else that people were using that's heavier than water goes to the bottom of the tank, and it gets cleaned up by the action of moving it around with your hands. And we call these different fractions the light fraction of stuff that floats and the heavy fraction of stuff that sinks. And then we can take these back to the laboratory, and using magnifying glasses and microscopes and things like that, we can identify the types of animals and plants that people were using for food. And so on the bottom right here, we've got an example of what one of these samples looks like in the laboratory. So I'll talk first about this one particular site where we've spent the most time doing research in this project, site CASMA 113, which is the name of the main site in Coroste Valley that we think could be the location of Metene or Casa Grande. So this site, part of it was disturbed, meaning that it was mixed up by plowing and earth movement activities in the 19th century. But it also has intact deposits that date from 1,000 to 1,300 of the Common Era, or about 700 to 1,000 years ago. So in our approach, we tried to disturb as little of the site as possible using different techniques that, called geophysical survey that allow us to see what's underground before we dig, which are not perfect, but they prevent us from having to disturb as much of the archaeological site when we're looking for intact deposits. So we focused on low impact archaeology and then collecting a lot of these flotation samples and getting as much data as we could about biological resources, both plants and animals that people were using at these sites. And so our main question in terms of looking at the food plants that people were eating is, what does the food tell us about the vegetation types? And what do the vegetation types tell us about the presence or absence of prescribed burning? So were people mainly eating nut and berry foods, which would indicate that the vegetation around them may have been dominated by forests and shrublands? Or were they mainly eating seed foods from coastal prairie landscapes, which would indicate that prescribed burning was in effect at this time, 700 to 1,000 years ago? Or do we see both, which could tell us that they're doing both things? And here's what we found. Now we get into the seed pictures. So the most abundant food plant type that we saw at the archaeological site, SMA 113, was the grains of native grasses. And just here's some photos of examples of some of the types of grasses that we saw. And these are grasses that are attested, in different types of California, in different parts of California, as grasses that are used in pinole, that are collected as seed food by tribes. Things like California brome grass, blue wild rye, purple needlegrass, California canary grass, and the grasses that tend to have the larger seeds that are a bit easier to process than the ones that have smaller seeds. And these were the most abundant type of plant food that we saw. And you can see here on the left, there's a photo of what these fragments of grass grains look like. They're difficult to identify down to the genus or species level because these types of seeds don't have a hard seed coat, and they tend to warp and puff up, and they don't retain their shape very well when they're burned. But we can at least say that they're grasses for sure because of the characteristic shape and the way that they burn. Another plant species that turned up very frequently at SMA 113 was Yarcus in Mutsun, or coast tarweed in English, Mattea sativa. This is a plant that lots of tribes in California use tarweeds for food. And we've got the flower here on the left. It's in the sunflower family. You can see it's got a composite flower head. And then on the right, you can see the flower head develops into this little cup that just holds all of the seeds inside it. And then you can bend over the top of these seed heads and shake them out to release the seeds into baskets and things to collect them. And here's what the seeds look like. So you can see they look a little bit like little sunflower seeds, and that's what they taste like too. So up on the top right, we have uncarbonized modern coast tarweed seeds, and on the bottom left, we have the archaeological tarweed seeds from Coroste Valley. And the way that we're identifying these seeds, it's not using DNA or chemical analysis or residue analysis, because all of that type of information or data is destroyed in the burning process. It's just a matter of looking at the shape and the surface texture and the anatomical characteristics of the seeds and comparing them the modern versus the archaeological, to figure out what it could be. And so these tarweed seeds are another one of the most abundant types of seeds that we see at SMA 113 and some of these other sites. Another pretty common type of seed is native clover seeds. And clover seeds can have really interesting and variable patterning on them. So I always enjoy looking at modern clover seeds. Here's just some examples of pinpoint clover, modern pinpoint clover seeds on the left, and the archaeological clover seeds down at the bottom right. And so something to say about clover seeds is that we certainly cannot identify these down to the species level, unfortunately, because lots of different species of clover seed make seeds that look very, very similar. And the main way you can tell them apart when they're modern seeds is by the color. And you lose that, of course, when they're carbonized. And they also, as you can see, they warp and they fragment. They also don't have a very hard seed coat. And so we can say that there's lots of evidence for native clovers in Coroste Valley, but we don't know which ones they were. Native people typically used clover for greens food, and in some cases, probably as a seed food as well. Another seed that we saw at Coroste Valley, which was intriguing, was the seeds of red maize. And you can see the modern seeds here on the left. They're very small. They're only a little bit more than a millimeter in size, but the plants produce these seeds fairly abundantly. These are annuals, and they're in the same family as miner's lettuce, which many of you may know as a greens food that lots of people still eat today. And red maize can be used as a greens food as well, but they were one of the favorite seed foods for the Mutsun ancestors. And so what's intriguing about it is that we saw red maize showing up at Coroste Valley in the archaeological site, not in very large numbers, but they were there. But for a very long time, we didn't see any red maize plants in Coroste Valley or really anywhere around on the landscape today. They seem to be fairly uncommon. And it's only this year when a tribe member was out at Coroste Valley with a botanist, and they were doing some survey work around some of the burn piles that the Amah Mutsun native stewards have been creating at Coroste Valley. They've been burning Douglas fir trees that were cut down. They found red maize plants that were growing, 5 plants that were growing around the edge of one of these burn piles. And so it's probably the removal of burning, of prescribed burning as a disturbance factor, that has reduced the incidence of this plant on the landscape, but it is still out there. And now we're working to propagate red maize to bring them back in Coroste Valley. Another important native plant that is not local to the area, but is one of my favorite seeds, and so I had to show you all this plant, is native tobacco. It's called Indian tobacco, Nicotiana quadrivalvus. The common name is Indian tobacco. And archaeologists who study plants love tobacco seeds because they're so easy to identify. If you look at the modern examples here on the top right, you can see it's got this jigsaw puzzle piece pattern of the little plates of the seed that fit together in this intricate way. And you can see these as well on the archaeological seeds. If they're well preserved enough, they show up fairly clearly. And so it's very easy to identify a tobacco seed, even if it's charred. And here's some more examples of less well preserved ones from Coroste Valley. This is a plant that doesn't naturally occur locally, but could have been traded in and was an important trade item for Native people in California. And here's a few of the other taxa that we see at the archaeological site in Coroste Valley. Things like bed straw, Gallium aparini, plantagos, wild plantains, and phacelias. The phacelia and other things like Amsinkia or fiddleneck, which shows up in the archaeological sites, these are plants that are also not abundant on the landscape today, and they're associated with disturbance and with fire as well. So their absence or lack of commonality today is probably also associated with the lack of prescribed burning. So after spending many years identifying seeds from these flotation samples, here's the summary of what we found. So out of almost 50,000 identified seeds, almost all of the plant foods that we found at this site in Coroste Valley were coastal prairie seed foods. So the color coding here on the pie chart, anything that's green is something that's associated with coastal prairie or wetland habitats. The light green is coastal prairie, the dark green is wetland. And then anything that has a little blue star beside it is a plant that is ethnographically reported or still used today by tribes as a food. So if we compare the coastal prairie seed foods to the nut foods, which are here in yellow, we can see that the assemblage of plant foods is really dominated by these coastal prairie seed foods. And so that tells us that there must have been extensive coastal prairies around at that time in order for people to harvest these foods and eat them regularly throughout this time period from 700 to 1,000 years ago. The seeds of the panicled bulrush are pretty intriguing. Those may have also been used as a food source, but we're not sure because we don't have ethnographic or oral history accounts of that being used, but they do appear to be edible. Panicled bulrush is a wetland aquatic plant. It could have also been used for other purposes too, like possibly crafting or construction. So that one is a little bit ambiguous, but we did find a lot of those seeds. So I think they could have been used as a food as well. And so that was the first phase of our research, just looking at Coroste Valley and this one site, SMA 113. But then we expanded our research to look at a lot of other sites in southern San Mateo and northern Santa Cruz County. And here's the list of sites that we looked at. We divided these into coastal strand sites, which are sites that are very close to the ocean. A lot of them are in the sand dune systems on Año Nuevo Point. And then inland sites that are a bit further away from the ocean, anywhere from maybe half a kilometer to a few kilometers away from the ocean. And then the color coding is indicating the age of the sites. So the green sites are less than 1,000 years old. The yellow sites here are between about 3,000 and 1,000 years old. And then the orange color is sites that are more than about 3,000 years old. And we only have one of those. And what this chart up on the right here is showing is it's comparing the density of nutshells and of edible seeds at these different sites that we looked at. And by density, it's either the weight of the material. So for nutshell, we're looking at the grams per liter of archaeological soil, or the number of things per liter of soil. So for seeds, we're looking at the number of seeds per liter of soil that we recover from these sites. And this chart just kind of summarizes the results of all of our samples from these different sites. So if we look at the coastal sites, which are in this left part of the graph, we can see that there's a very low density of either nutshell or edible seeds. And what this is telling us is that these sites were probably not used for plant food processing. They're not places where people would have gone and, prepared either seed food or nut food. It's not clear whether or not, the people may have brought prepared food to these sites and eaten it there, but, this isn't a place where they would have been gathering these foods together and processing them. But on the other hand, if we look at the inland sites, we can see that in terms of nutshell, there's either low density of nutshell. So this is the site in Coroste Valley. It has low nutshell. But some of these other sites that we looked at in Santa Cruz County, they had higher incidence of nutshell. So at these sites, people were using more nuts, or at least processing more nuts and burning them than they were at the site in Coroste Valley. And among all of these sites, the inland sites, we see good evidence and high densities of edible seeds. So the same types of coastal prairie seed foods that we saw at site SMA 113 in Corose Valley are showing up in these other sites as well. And they're even showing up in one of these sites that's a bit older than the one in Corose Valley, one that dates back even a little bit more than 1,000 years ago. And so what this is telling us, it's indicating that the use of prescribed burning to maintain these extensive coastal prairies is not looking like something that's really localized to Año Nuevo Point or Corose Valley. It's looking like something that we see in this coastal region at all of these archaeological sites that we've looked at least at the inland sites. We see good evidence for people eating these coastal prairie seed foods. All right. So, what we concluded, and I'm only talking about archaeological seeds, today, there's lots of other lines of evidence that we looked at that we also brought to bear on this question. But we concluded that at least for the past 1,000 years, and maybe a little bit more than that, there's good evidence that Native people were using prescribed burning to maintain extensive coastal prairies and for other purposes too, in this region west of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so now the tribe, through the Amah Mutsun Land Trust, wants to work to revitalize these traditional practices. So for anybody who may not have heard about Amah Mutsun Land Trust before, it's quite a bit different from most conventional land trusts. Most land trusts have the goal of acquiring land and then transferring it to a public agency to take care of over the long term. But for Amah Mutsun Land Trust, the main goal is to revitalize and reestablish the tribe's traditional stewardship relationship with lands in its traditional territory and stewardship area. And so the main goal is not to acquire land necessarily, but to make it possible for tribe members to take care of the land, and also to work with agencies and members of the public to educate them about this aspect of tribal lifeways and foodways, the importance of stewarding the land and taking care of it in this way. And that's why events such as this one, where we get to share our work, are so important. So the primary program of the Amah Mutsun Land Trust is called the Native Stewardship Corps. And that's a program that brings together tribe members to do conservation work and learn how to do that type of work. But it also provides them with opportunities for cultural education and and participation in scientific research programs, such as archaeological programs and vegetation surveys and other types of biological surveys and things like that. Some of the other major programs that the Land Trust is developing is a cultural burning program. The Land Trust and the tribe would like to have a tribal fire crew one day that would be able to plan and carry out cultural burns once again, as well as ocean stewardship, native plant restoration work, work to protect sacred sites, such as Uristock. Some of you may have heard about the efforts to preserve Uristock, one of the tribe's most sacred landscapes in southern Santa Clara County. So all of these are different things that the Land Trust is working on. So I'll focus a bit on the work that the Land Trust has done in Corose Valley. Ever since we completed this first phase of our research there, it gave us the guidance to go back to Corose Valley and start taking out these woody vegetation types, especially the Douglas firs and the coastal shrublands that have been taking over and crowding out the coastal prairies at Corose Valley. And it's really important to do this there because there are parts of the coastal prairie in Corose Valley that still have good representation of native species and high densities of native species. In many places, the exotic plants from other parts of the world have come into the coastal prairies and really crowded out the native plants. And so it's rare to find a coastal prairie that still has, even 25% of the plant cover being by native plants. In most cases, it'll be 90% or more non-native plants. And so where you do have native coastal prairies, it's very important to preserve them and to prevent them from being turned into other vegetation types, because it's much easier to preserve native coastal prairies than it is to try to bring them back. So here's some photos of the types of work that the Native Stewardship Corps has been doing in Coroste Valley, removing the Doug fir trees, pulling out invasive poison hemlock, which has the potential to poison the landscape and poison native people who are collecting seeds for food at Coroste Valley. Here's a photo from Coroste Valley of the Native Stewardship Corps working together with state parks to create a shaded fuel break underneath some of these young Douglas fir forests there in order to increase fire safety. So this is a place where a lot of the young Doug fir trees were removed, and then they made these piles, and the piles are burned to reduce the fuel loads in the forest understory. And this shows the outcomes of the work that the Native Stewardship Corps has been doing with state parks over the past few years now. On the left, we see this young Doug fir forest that's been expanding for the past several decades. And on the right, we see places where the trees have been taken out. And you can see all these little dots on the map, which are the little burn piles that the stewards are creating. And so for the past few years, State Parks has been providing funding to Amah Mutsun Land Trust and the Native Stewardship Corps to do this fuel reduction work. But unfortunately, that funding could not be used for native plant propagation and restoration. But the tribe wanted to make sure that it could replace the plants that are being removed with native coastal prairie plants. And so back in 2019, the tribe applied for, the Amah Mutsun Land Trust applied for Prop 68 funding, state bond measure funding through the Cultural, Community, and Natural Resource Grant Program that would provide support for actually doing native plant propagation work to support restoration of the coastal prairie in the places where the woody plants are being removed. And so that project was supposed to get started in early 2020, but just as we were gearing up to get it going, COVID happened. And it took several months for us to adjust to COVID and to get the Native Stewardship Corps going again. And then right as we were planning to start work on it in late summer of 2020, the CZU fire complex happened, and it impacted the place that we were working, Cascade Ranch, as well as our project partner, Pie Ranch, and of course impacted state parks as well. And so this project got started a year late, only at the beginning of this year. But between the native stewards who have been working on it and a wonderful team of volunteers who have been devoting incredible amounts of time to help us with this project, we've been able to get back up to speed to meet our goals. And so what we're trying to do with this project are a few different things. The biggest goal, or the biggest task, is producing 120,000 plants. So 90,000 plants that will be planted out at this place, Cascade Ranch on Año Nuevo Point. And those plants are going to be used for seed production, for seeds that will be sown at Coroste Valley. We're also producing 30,000 plants that will be planted directly out at Coroste Valley. And so far, we began those 90,000 plugs in February of this year. And sometime in the next couple of weeks, we're going to meet our 90,000 plant goal. We're at about 85 or 86,000 right now, thanks to the help of all of the volunteers that have been working on the project. We're also going to be sowing these plant seeds, on at least 5 acres at Coroste Valley, removing invasive exotic species from the valley floor and the ridgeline, things like poison hemlock and jubata grass and bull thistle and things like that. And we're going to continue removing Doug fir trees as well. And here's some other photographs from that project. So on the left, we have some photos of our field beds where we've been planting these native plants for seed production. We plant them very densely together to create like a patch of native plants. And this helps us keep the weeds under control in the field. And it also seems to be doing a pretty good job, allowing the plants to produce abundantly their seeds without us having to spend too much time taking other plants out. And the photo on the right, these are a patch of red maize that we planted from those seeds that we harvested from Cuthrell Valley earlier this year, from that first set of plants that we were able to find around the burn piles that the native stewards made. So we're really happy with the opportunity to be able to do this project, and grateful to all of our project partners for supporting it. And I just want to acknowledge all the different organizations that have been supporting the work at Cuthrell Valley, state parks, of course, and the UC researchers. The San Mateo Resource Conservation District has been providing tremendous support to the project in terms of biological monitoring and helping us with administration of the project. National Science Foundation funded a lot of the research that we did. And now, of course, the California Prop 68 bond measure funding that's supporting the native plant propagation work. So thanks again very much to Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History for inviting us to participate in this program. It's always wonderful to be able to share the work that we're doing, to get the word out to others. And thank you all for attending the talk tonight. And if any of you would like to learn more about Amah Mutsun Land Trust, or if you're interested in supporting the Land Trust financially, the place to go is amahmutsunlandtrust.org. And that concludes the talk for tonight. And we can move on to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rob. That was just amazing. And you guys have been doing such amazing work figuring out stories from the past, and then really putting what you've learned to good use. Just really amazing stuff. And we've had a few questions come through. The first one I want to highlight is people are wondering how they can help. So you mentioned that you have a lot of volunteers helping out with your plant propagation and planting. Are you still looking for volunteers? Are there other volunteer opportunities?
Yeah, so when we were putting together this project, because of all the delays, we were a bit worried whether we'd be able to do it. And we decided to put together this volunteer team, and we sent out a message to the AMLT email list. And we asked for people to apply for volunteer positions. And we asked them to make a pretty big commitment. We asked them to devote at least 8 hours a month for 3 months. And we got 140 applications. So we've got as many volunteers as we can handle for the moment, and we've also got a wait list for volunteers for that project. But what I'll say is that we're about to hire a new program manager for the native plant restoration work that Amah Mutsun Land Trust is doing. And it's possible that this work could be expanding in the future. And so any opportunities to volunteer with AMLT that arise, or any expansions of the volunteer team at Cascade Ranch, the announcements for those will go out over the AMLT email list. So if anybody's interested in hearing about that, just go to the website, amahmutsunlandtrust.org, and sign up for the email list. And that way you'll get the notifications about volunteer opportunities.
And I'll make sure, I'm going to send a follow-up email to everyone who registered after this, listing some resources for further learning, but I'll also make sure to link to, for signing up to the newsletter, making donations, things like that. And we have more questions coming through. So Marcy is curious about how you know that the seeds that you are finding at these various sites are remains of human cooking versus the result of human set or natural fire. So did you select where you were taking those samples from, like purposely, because it seemed to be from a cooking location?
Yep. So that's a great question. It's probably the most common one that I get about these charred seeds that we get out of the ground. And the answer is it can get very complex, but the simple answer is it's because these seeds are coming from archaeological sites. They're coming from places where deposits that are the outcomes of human activity have been accumulating for years and years. And a lot of them are coming, we prefer to draw them from intact archaeological deposits. So an example of an intact archaeological deposit is something like an event where somebody cleans out their hearth. They rake up all the ashes and the charcoal, they might put it in a basket, and then they might go dump it in a pit. And then as we're excavating, if the conditions are right and it hasn't been disturbed, we can see that basket full of ash and material that was cleaned out of the hearth. And we can excavate that out particularly and process that as one of these flotation samples. So, that's one way that we tell that it's coming from cultural practices, is that it's clearly linked to something that humans created. But another way that we can tell more generally is just that, if you're working at a disturbed site where you don't have very intact deposits, it's just the density of the plant remains that we see. So if I'm looking at an archaeological site or I'm looking at, a soil, I might just see, if I'm looking at a natural soil out on the landscape, maybe I'll see a very low density of charred plant materials, maybe just 1 or 2 or 3 charred seeds per liter of soil. And if I see that at an archaeological site, it tells me there's probably not much plant processing going on, because it's no different than what I would see out on the natural landscape or on the landscape at large. But if I see 50 seeds in a liter of soil, that tells me that there's something else going on, that, there's something, humans, using plants in a way that are exposing them to fire and causing much more of them to be charred than you would have otherwise. Yeah.
And in terms of dating them, are you able to carbon date the charred seeds? Is that how you know the year?
That's right. So radiocarbon dating is an amazing tool. You can radiocarbon date an individual seed as small as a tobacco seed, which is maybe 0.5 millimeter in size. And from that, you can get a date range that might be, plus or minus 20 or 30 years.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Someone's also, just since we're on this subject, how deep are the deposits and how do you find them? So when you're doing the X-ray, looking at the landscape, do you notice that there are parts that might have that kind of hearth, deposits in them, or if that makes sense?
Yeah. Typically, the way that archaeological sites are discovered is because they'll have artifacts on the surface that people can recognize. So, if the site itself isn't on the surface of the soil, then burrowing animals will bring up artifacts from below. There are also buried sites. If you imagine a site on a valley floor, it may over time get covered up by layers of silt from flooding or things like this. And those types of sites are discovered, most often if it's like eroding out of a creek bank, or if somebody's doing a construction project and they're drilling down and they start to find artifacts. So the way that these particular sites that we've worked on were discovered was through archaeological surveys that looked at the surface of the soil and just saw lots of artifacts there. And the deposits that we work with typically go down about 1 meter or so. So, about 3 feet or 4 feet down into the soil. But that varies a lot depending on the site. There are some sites that are many meters deep, and there are some sites that are only, 10 or 20 centimeters deep.
Okay. Lots of questions coming through. What historical academic work most needs to be done in order to support tribal stewardship efforts?
Oh, that's a big question. So there are lots of students, graduate students and undergrads who, ask how they can help, and that's fantastic. So the types of research that are useful are historical ecological research that goes further back in time, I would say, than just what's written documentation. Things that involve, archaeology and paleoecology, paleoenvironmental studies, environmental studies, things that'll help us better understand these types of processes not just out on the coast where we've been working, but in other places as well. We're hoping that this type of research can be a model for other parts of California and other parts of North America too. In terms of the tribe and the land trust and the interests that we've been talking about recently, it's important for us to understand with climate change looming, what are the implications of prescribed burning for things like climate change? There's a lot of focus lately on using forests for carbon sequestration. And so one thing that we'd like to understand better how does a native perennial dominated coastal prairie landscape sequester carbon in relationship to an exotic annual grassland? The native grasslands have plants that have very deep root systems that go down, 10 feet or more into the ground. And that's putting carbon down in the ground. But, how much carbon is that sequestering versus other vegetation types like forests or annual grasslands? And then, just understanding, ecological dynamics and fire better, understanding which species are threatened by absence of fire, and which species really need fire to persist and which may benefit from it as time goes on and climate change continues. So all of those different topics, we could talk about it for hours.
Yeah, it's the aspect of adding on a changing landscape and how the tribe adapts to that is also very interesting. Somewhat along the lines of something you just said about how the work needs to be done elsewhere throughout the region and throughout the state. Sherry's curious if there are other areas that have work by maybe tribal organizations or land trusts doing similar work that you know of in other parts of the state.
There's been similar types of work on indigenous burning in far northern California in the Klamath area and in places like Yosemite. Those are the spots that I know of. There may be other places too where people are initiating these types of projects or they, haven't published them yet. There's been some work in Southern California too, but it's been mostly based in ethnography and oral histories, I think, rather than archaeology. There's been some archaeological work, but I don't know if it's been done in this kind of historical, ecological, integrative way that we've been doing. Mm-hmm. But it is, I think, expanding these types of efforts. Yeah.
So let me go over to this Q&A box. So Lawrence asks, have you examined phytoliths in soil cores and pollens in pond sediments? If so, have you found any other native grasses such as purple needlegrass and creeping wild rye?
Yeah, I spent a couple of years of my life looking at silica phytoliths and figuring out how to isolate them from soils as well as I could. So I'll say a couple of words about that. Phytoliths are these microscopic structures that are produced only by certain types of plants, things like grasses and sedges, horsetails, and interestingly, Doug firs also make phytoliths. And so part of our studies in Coroste Valley included sampling soils and the sediments in the valley floor for phytoliths to understand whether or not there was a long-term history of grassland vegetation. If there's no phytoliths, that's evidence for a lack of grasslands. If there's lots of phytoliths, it tells you that there's a long-term history of grassland vegetation. And we did see lots of phytoliths. So if you want to read more about our phytolith work, we have a publication from 2013 in the journal California Archaeology that's about that. And my dissertation has a chapter on phytolith work as well.
Okay, I'll try to find that and link in the email if I can. Yeah. Also from Lawrence, curious, so we've been talking about plant remains and you mentioned shells. Lawrence I think this is not thinking about the archaeological evidence. I believe he's thinking about time actually spent in these locations. Have you found any Ohlone tiger beetle in Coroste Valley coastal prairies or maybe some of your other sites? Have you noticed any, I guess, endangered insects such as the Ohlone tiger beetle?
We haven't, but that's because I'm not an insect expert, and I wouldn't recognize it if I saw it. I'm sorry to say. Uh, Something like that, if it is organic, it's likely that it would have been biodegraded by the time that we would get the samples, unless the insects were charred. And even if they were, it's unlikely that they would preserve well enough to identify. So I'm afraid I can't really speak to that issue. I don't know of there are very few archaeologists that study insects, and usually they're looking at very special preservation contexts, places where you have um, very dry conditions where things don't break down the same way that they do here. Yeah.
And in terms of the tribe and the land trust's current efforts, do you know if any one is focusing on maybe pollinator relationships or thinking about insects and just animals in general and their relationships with the landscape?
Not yet, but I can say we're definitely interested in learning more about, how all of these different habitat types work together and how, coastal prairies support pollinators and vice versa. So, it's just a matter of building the capacity to get there.
Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned, they're hiring for that position and many others. So hopefully they'll be getting up to capacity soon. Another question from Lawrence. I'd like to understand how traditional burning was practiced in the now grasslands of the Santa Cruz Mountains and slopes. How extensive, time of year, mosaic?
Yeah, it's hard to give a quick answer to that, because a lot of it we don't know the details of, and going into what I think was happening and why I think it would be another talk. So a lot of it is based on inferences from tribes that were able to continue these practices into the more recent past, tribes that still have living memory of using prescribed burning or that still use it today. That is how we get information about what the probable time of year and the rotational cycles and the frequency and things like that would have been. We do have a tiny bit of historical evidence about that from the earliest Spanish writers and explorers. So they would, in some cases, record things like the time of year that burning was happening or the extent of burning. And part of that has been what I'll say is, for my dissertation work, I went back through some of those early documents and reconstructed, for example, the extent of burning that was reported by the Portola expedition, the first expedition that came through this region overland. But after that, Spanish colonial people, they tended not to really write very much about native people and their burning practices in any kind of detail. So a lot of it is based on inference from other tribes in other parts of the state.
Speaking of Portola, we did have a question earlier on. Let me find it. You mentioned that Portola's group had trouble finding fodder for their mules and horses. What would prevent those mammals from eating the grasses from the coastal prairies? I'm imagining that they were encountering an area that had very sufficiently been burned. And so the practice was to burn a large area and then be in another area.
Yeah. So that's I didn't communicate that very well, maybe. But the burning, this was in the Salinas Valley. And as the expedition was coming up the valley, the burning was so extensive that they had trouble finding a place to camp where the animals would have enough fodder to eat because native people had recently burned off that landscape.
And I think that's all for the questions from the people joining us. If you have any last questions, get them in the chat. But I have one. Well, two things come to mind. One is about you're showing off pile burning occurring at Kuroste and creating a fuel break. Has the Land Trust been able to do burning that's more of that like slow creeping throughout the landscape type? I don't know what the term is for that.
So yeah, it's just called generally prescribed burning or landscape burning. It's burning that's at a larger scale. It's continuous. And so we'd like to do that. And we're planning to do that in association with state parks. But the tribe also wants to be, in the land trust, we want to be careful about doing that because we want to make sure that, whatever area is burned, there's the resources to go in after that burn and take care of the plants that are there, either sow native seed or, install plants to make sure that the exotics don't come in and, take over some of those areas potentially. So another consideration in Coroste Valley is it's a little bit more difficult to do prescribed burning there because it's considered a critical habitat for the San Francisco garter snake, which is a fully protected species. So special measures and planning have to be put into place before a prescribed burn can be done in Coroste Valley. But ever since the CZU complex last year burned a lot of the areas around Coroste Valley, and bulldozers came through and made fire breaks in other places around Coroste Valley. It's a much more defensible landscape now than it was just a few years ago. And so Amah Mutsun Land Trust and state parks are working together to put a burn plan into place and hopefully do prescribed burning at Coroste Valley in the next few years.
Cool. Yeah, can't wait to learn more about that. And I can see how it's a complicated matter when the amount of space that you're working with is limited too, and the amount of intact coastal prairie is also limited. Doesn't seem quite so simple. My last question for you is just about the new Chitoni Coast Dairies property that's going to be opening up in a couple of years. I know that the tribe has been in collaboration with the land managers there, and I'm just curious if there's anything coming with that property or if there's been any work done there.
Yeah, so the work that Amah Mutsun Land Trust has done at Chitoni Coast Dairies is work that I had the opportunity to be involved in quite heavily in 2019. And the Land Trust worked together with the Bureau of Land Management to do what we call integrative and proactive cultural resource survey of portions of that property. And that was part of, it was meant to provide information during the planning process. The Bureau of Land Management just finalized not too long ago its resource management plan for that property. And so we wanted to go in and do these surveys to identify sensitive cultural resources and issues of concern to provide BLM with that information so that they could incorporate it into the planning process. And those efforts were very meaningful because we were able to identify resources that had not been discovered before, and we provided BLM with information about those and guidance. And the BLM Central Coast Field Office did a very good job incorporating the concerns of the tribe and Amah Mutsun Land Trust into its planning efforts. So I guess what I'll say is, the way that planning for the use of that landscape has been put into place is, has been designed to protect the sensitive cultural resources that we know of on the property currently. And the Amah Mutsun Land Trust and BLM, they have a memorandum of understanding that says that they'll continue to work together collaboratively to protect those sensitive resources on the property as time goes on. So that could involve additional integrative cultural resource survey and stewardship of both natural and cultural resources on the property as time goes on.
Looking forward to seeing what new projects that the Land Trust has in the works, and hopefully more and more access to land throughout their ancestral homeland will be coming. And I think 7:14ish, so we can call it a night. I do want to remind people that the museum has an exhibit up right now all about seeds. And after seeing Rob's presentation, I'm very inspired to look more closely at seeds. Is that something where, did you have a bunch of seeds and compared them, or do you just have all that in your brain where what a tar plant seed looks like?
So people who do this work, they have to create these seed reference collections. So at Berkeley, I was fortunate to have a collection of seeds that was created by geographers back in the 1920s through the 1940s. And those are housed in one of the labs, the archaeobotany lab at UC Berkeley. And so I would rely heavily on that collection. And I also got seeds to create my own collection from the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. From their seed and plant propagation program, they allowed us to sample their collections, as well as from the California Seed Herbarium. So there are actually these sources out there that you can draw on to find these seeds and then learn how to identify them.
Really amazing. Yeah, I just seeing the different versions slide after slide, it made me appreciate how variable they are. And I want to start paying more close attention to seeds now. So thank you so much, Rob. And to everyone joining us, again, I'll be sending out an email probably tomorrow with a link to the recording of this program so you can share it out, as well as some other resources. And yeah, just thank you so very much, Rob, and hope to work with you again in the future.
Thank you, Marissa.
Okay. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.